Hi all, and welcome back to English 2. Today we'll be doing our second video for the week, where we'll be doing our introduction to poetry, and specifically we'll be working with the poem One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. And as promised in my last video, we will also be watching a clip from a movie where Cameron Diaz's character also analyzes this same poem. And then as far as our discussion topic goes, we'll talk about how we would compare the reading that we're doing to the reading that she does, maybe the issues we find with her reading, where she does it well, where she does it poorly, where she is doing those close reading things that we recommend doing based on our video last week, and where she's maybe doing some of those close reading things I recommend not doing, as talked about in our video last week. So, before we get into One Art, though, or the movie, we will want to get, again, some kind of basic terminology, just so that we're on the same page and able to discuss things with sort of a reasonable expectation that we're all using the same words to describe the same things. So, specifically today we'll talk about a couple of different elements of poetic form that have to do with specifically the way that a poem is written. And several of these are going to be things we'll talk about a lot. We'll talk about in more detail later in the semester when we look at other poems. The terms I'd like us to talk about today are specifically a stanza, also sometimes called a verse. Especially in like pop music, we tend to call a stanza a verse. Sometimes we use it in poetry, but we tend to use stanza in poetry because we also use the word verse to just refer to poetry in general. So just to avoid ambiguity and confusion, we tend to use the term stanza, but they both mean the same thing. So a stanza or a verse, in the case of like a pop song or something, is a group of lines into which a part of a poem has been divided. Often poems will be divided into a set of stanzas, or sets of stanzas, and these basically just kind of set apart kind of units that for the most part are going to be standing alone in some way. So in pop songs, for example, the chorus is going to tend to be a stanza separate from each of the verses, which of course, we tend to often separate the chorus and the verse, but we also will sometimes call them all verses. And they are all stanzas, certainly by more standard poetic terminology. So, but when we talk about pop music, each of those verses is a stanza. The chorus is a stanza that will often get repeated as a repeated kind of series of words or lines. It's a refrain. Stanzas, those divisions that we see poetry divided into, usually divided by like blank lines or blank space. The other thing I'd like us to bring up today, and again, something we'll talk about in more detail later, is rhyme. Specifically, when we talk about poetry, the way we tend to talk about it we talk about what kind of rhyme a poem has, and we talk about the rhyme scheme a poem has. So the kind of rhyme that happens with every rhyme. There's obviously a perfect rhyme, which is a rhyme that is, as you might guess, perfect. Think moon, June, spoon. Exact same vowel sound, exact same consonant sound you're ending with. It's a perfect rhyme. Then we also have near rhymes or slant rhymes. These are rhymes that kind of work. They kind of rhyme, but they kind of don't. And a good example of this might be good and food. They look like they rhyme on the page, which makes them something we call an I rhyme, which we'll talk about later in the semester. And they almost rhyme, like good and foo are close-ish sounds, like and ooh, but they're not the same sound. And so good and food is not a perfect rhyme. Although it sort of works as a rhyme, it's also not 100% there. So we tend to call that a slant rhyme or a near rhyme. And we'll talk a little bit about why those maybe are important. So perfect rhymes are called that because they fit perfectly into the pattern that is a rhyme scheme. As human beings, we like patterns. And we like things that fit into the patterns because they're predictable. It means we can guess what comes next. It's not going to come at us out of nowhere. And so we like things that fit patterns. It's one of those things we've just kind of evolved to do because patterns means you can predict the future, and that means that there's less unpredictability and dangerousness. One of the things that slant rhymes do is they don't quite break the pattern, but they also don't quite keep the pattern. And so as a result, if we have a rhyme scheme, a pattern of rhyme, and we don't, like we've been getting these perfect rhymes like moon, June, spoon, or good, hood, and then suddenly we get something that doesn't quite fit. Like, a good slant rhyme for moon, June, spoon. But certainly for good or hood, there's something like food. It kind of works, but it kind of doesn't. It's not enough to take us fully out of the pattern, to take us fully out of the rhyme and say, hey, this doesn't rhyme at all. But it's also not 100% fitting into the pattern. One of the things that those near rhymes or slant rhymes tend to do is they draw our attention to those moments. Like, often when we're doing close reading, those are some of the moments we'll notice because the fact that we have a rhyme that doesn't quite work draws our attention. It also tends to give us a slight sense of uneasiness or like there's something a little out of place. That's because in part there is. But also in part it's because patterns we find soothing, we tend to find predictable. A slant rhyme or near rhyme is suggesting that maybe we're not fully out of it, but it's not as predictable and not quite as, like, we can't relax as much as we might normally. So they tend to create a bit of a feeling of unease, a slight feeling of like there's something maybe slightly off, or maybe things aren't 100% as they appear. In general, near rhymes or slant rhymes pull our attention to those moments because they make them seem a little more important and a little more distinctive. One of the other things that a slant rhyme will do, though, is it will mix things up a bit. If you have nothing but perfect rhymes, nothing but everything fitting that pattern, that moon, June, spoon, it's really easy for a rhyming poem to get sing-songy, and it's really easy to kind of zone out or like lose interest or lose focus because it's not giving us any surprises. We know what to expect, and we're getting exactly what we expect. And so too much perfect rhyme can sometimes, especially in a longer poem, tend to kind of make you just kind of sing-song and kind of just like lose interest. One of the things that a near rhyme or a slant rhyme will do is it does mix that up a little, and it makes it a lot more possible for us to, it kind of makes us sit up and pay attention and say, hey, like, this was not what I was expecting, and therefore maybe I need to focus and pay a little closer attention. So, rhyme, one of those things that can do a lot, and the reason I bring this up is that we will have a couple of near/slant rhymes in this poem. Finally, to talk about rhyme schemes. A rhyme scheme is just a pattern of rhyming that a poem takes. And specifically, what I want to bring up is that when we talk about poetry, we tend to kind of chart out rhyme schemes based on what rhymes with what. And we tend to chart that out with letters. So in the case of One Art, if you look at our first stanza, our rhyming words at the end of the lines are master, intent, disaster. We would write that as ABA because our A lines, master and disaster, rhyme with each other. Our B line does not rhyme with either of those, although it does rhyme with B lines in future stanzas. So in this case, it's an ABA, ABA, ABA. and so on until you get to the final stanza, which mixes things up a bit. So that's just kind of the way that we map out rhymes. Obviously, you can have more than 2 rhyme sounds. So you can have like A, B, A, B. You can have A, B, A, C. You can have A, B, B, C, C. A lot of different things that you can do as far as your rhyme scheme goes. But just keep in mind that those, like all of your A lines will rhyme with each other. All of your B lines will rhyme with each other, and so on. So we've talked about stanzas. We've talked about rhymes. That then brings us to our kind of third piece of terminology that I'd like to bring up today, and that is the villanelle. The reason I'm bringing this up is that one art is something, it is a type of poem called a villanelle, and we'll talk maybe about why that might be relevant. But a villanelle is a poem with only 2 rhyme sounds, so it has an A and a B, and that's it. There's no C. And as you read one art, you will see that it is in fact everything is that aster rhyme or that ent rhyme. The first and third lines of the first stanza are rhyming refrains. So they rhyme with each other and they repeat. Specifically, they repeat as the third line in each successive stanza, each stanza that comes after, and then at the very end of the poem, they form a couplet, 2 lines that rhyme with each other. So basically what this means is that the first and third lines, the art of losing isn't hard to master, and to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. These lines then repeat in some form. In this case, they repeat at the end of each subsequent stanza, each subsequent verse. So stanza 2 ends, the art of losing isn't hard to master. It's that first rhyming refrain. Second one, to travel, none of these will bring disaster. It's not an exact, but it's at the same idea. It ends with disaster, and it rhymes so it rhymes. And it also gets at the idea that losing something is not a disaster. Then the next stanza ends with the art of losing isn't hard to master, again repeating that first one. The next one, I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Losing something, it wasn't a disaster. And then our final 2 lines are, the art of losing is not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So we have, again, ending with that art of losing is not too hard to master, that first repeated line, and then our second repeated line saying that losing something isn't disaster. So, sometimes this is kind of a loose villanelle in the sense that it's not actually repeating that second rhyming line refrain. It's repeating it in part and in content, but it's not actually repeating the same line exactly. So, this is kind of the definition of a villanelle. And certainly this seems to match that definition. So, a little bit about villanelles to kind of help you think about why this author might have used this particular kind of poem for this. Because let's face it, a villanelle does not happen by accident. Villanelle is a poetic form historically been used for lighthearted and simple themes or topics. The name, you probably have recognized that there's an English-sounding word in there, even if it's not an English word. And that word is villain. It does, in fact, come from villain, but not the villain that we're probably thinking of. Not villain as in a bad guy, but villain with an E, V-I-L-L-E-I-N, which tends to mean like a peasant. Now, we can think about what it says that our word for, like, a bad person who does bad things comes from our word for, like, a peasant. But, that says a lot about European American culture. Well, really European culture, because that word came into English long before America was a thing. So it was a poem specifically about peasants. Now, of course, your average peasant in, 17th, 18th century, not writing a ton of poetry, in part because they may or may not be literate, and also because they have work to do. Like, if you're, a shepherd or a weaver or a farmer, like, you don't have a ton of free time to spend writing poetry. So, Villanelle's poetry about peasants, about, poor lower class people, written by wealthy upper class people who have the time to write poetry and the education to study it. As you might expect, a poem written about poor people by rich people tends to not represent poor people super accurately, especially because this is an era where the rich and the poor are living lives that are very different from each other. Like, your, average, poet in this era is like, a wealthy young man who maybe has done some sort of university or further study, and he's probably not interacting much, if at all, with farmers and shepherds and folks who do those sorts of things. Maybe he's interacting with domestic servants, but again, still probably doesn't have a particularly good understanding of what their life is like. And people who are actually living out in rural areas and don't have a ton to do with him, he's not gonna know much about them. So as a result, villanelles are part of this kind of entire trend during this era of rich people writing about poor people and idealizing poor people's lives. So it's part of this larger trend, or contributes to this larger trend, called the pastoral. Pastoral comes from pastor. It also the pasture of a congregation, and also the pasture that a sheep would eat in, or a cow, because pastor comes from shepherds. If you've read the Bible and what Jesus says about the flock and things like that, all of these are coming from the same idea of a shepherd taking care of sheep. And the pastoral is a very interesting idea of what shepherds and farmers and other kind of rural peasants' lives were like. A really good example of the pastoral is, you probably are familiar with this character from, Mother Goose for nursery rhymes, or even something like Toy Story, Little Bo Peep. We associate Little Bo Peep, we associate her with being a shepherdess, because, she usually has her shepherd's crook, and she has, some kind of little fluffy sheep. We also tend to associate her with specific kinds of clothing. Usually some kind of big bonnet, and then some dress with big old kind of hoop skirts, or very big, floofy, multi-layered skirts. So, how well do you think someone dressed like Little Bo Peep would function as an actual person having to take care of sheep, involving, keeping them under control and keeping them from running off, dealing with the fact that anywhere with a lot of sheep is going to have just a literal crap ton of sheep crap on the ground. How well do you think these massive skirts, and often they're dealt elaborately patterned and things like that, how well do you think that would work? The answer is it wouldn't. Little Bo Peep and characters like this were created by people who had no idea about actual taking care of sheep and what that entailed. But it was this very romantic idea of what it was like. So the pastoral, you have shepherds and shepherdesses, but there's never any emphasis on cleaning up crap, or being out in the cold and rain. It's all about, romantic, young, handsome, strapping shepherd lads and beautiful, dainty shepherdesses, and their little flirtations with the happy, frolicking sheep all around, the little lambs. Very pretty image, very unrealistic, very idealized and romantic, and having nothing to do with what actual shepherds were dealing with. And really the entire pastoral trend was like this. It was, I guess the better equivalent might be, I guess there's a kind of aesthetic called cottagecore, which is basically all about, kind of going back to nature and finding a place out in the country and living this, your best, like pioneer farm wife slash, like English cottage witch life. It's all very like natural and nutty granola, and it's very, lots of like white. It's very romantic. There's a lot of like, white dresses and, straw hats and sitting out in nature reading and things like that. Again, very nice image. You got someone who actually lives out in nature like that. They're probably going to have a very different idea of what that kind of life is like. Mostly it's a lot more work than it tends to get, tends to make it into those kind of cottagecore manifestos and aesthetics and things like that. So this is this trend that even still exists nowadays. But it was a very big thing in the 17th and 18th centuries. This idea of, like, life is really difficult when you're, a wealthy landowner with a lot of responsibilities and, like, power. And wouldn't it be easier to just be, a simple shepherd out in the beautiful fields with the fluffy sheep, flirting with the beautiful shepherd lady who also happens to be dressed very much like, a high society lady and not like, an actual shepherd girl, because, actual shepherd clothes are practical and not very pretty. So this is kind of the tradition that a Villanelle is coming out of. It's taking these things and making them seem like really like polished and beautiful and romantic, when actually they're kind of, grotty and like hard work and not particularly like pleasant or pretty. But due to either ignorance, whether willful or not, they're taking this and kind of making it into this beautiful idealized thing. So it tended to be used for lighthearted or simple themes or topics like romance and, that was the big thing with the pastoral, was like you had your handsome young shepherd lads and your beautiful young shepherd lasses, and they were flirting with each other and having romance. So this seems like, at first glance, an odd choice for a poem that makes it very clear from the beginning and all the way through the end, it is about losing. It is about losing things. Like, the one art of the title is the art of losing, as the first 4 words tell us. So, it seems a little odd. Definitely might change the way we think about and interpret the poem. So, let's go through the poem bit by bit and talk about what's going on the surface. So, stanza 1. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. On the surface, this seems pretty straightforward. It's not hard to get good at losing things. Some things even seem to be even losing themselves. So, it's not a disaster. Seems straightforward on the surface. Second stanza. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Again, surface seems pretty straightforward. Lose things. Just accept that you'll lose your keys. You'll waste an hour. It's easy to get good at this. It's not difficult to get good at this. Again, pretty straightforward. That said, we do see our first slant rhyme here with fluster, which sort of rhymes with disaster and master, but not quite. So there's something about that moment that maybe would jump out at us. Stanza 3. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. So the things that we're losing are changing. And as our narrator says, this is losing farther and faster. So you're losing things that are either farther away or that are farther on the scale of things to lose, and you're losing them faster. Places, names, where it was you meant to travel. Very different kinds of things from door keys or an hour. But again, none of these will bring disaster. Stanza 4. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So again, we're losing more things. In this case, the narrator lost their mother's watch and lost 1 or 2 of 3 loved houses. Again, and it's not hard to get good at losing. Stanza 5. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. So, our narrator is now losing cities, realms that they owned, rivers, a continent, and again we end, I miss them, but not a disaster. And then our final stanza, which gives us our couplet at the end. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. And here, we have our final thing of being lost, which seems bigger, so we start with even. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. So, something about this person inspires love in our narrator. But even losing you, I won't have lied. It's evident that the art of losing is not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it like disaster. So I know how to get good at losing things, even if it looks like disaster. Here again, we have a couple of those things that probably would jump out at us at the notice it step. Specifically, we have our second slant rhyme, gesture, which kind of rhymes with vaster, master, disaster, but not. It also doesn't rhyme with our previous one, fluster. And we also have this strange interjection in our final line. Write it. So our narrator is telling someone. Are they telling themselves? Are they telling someone else? Are they telling us? To write it, whatever it is. So, some moments that kind of maybe jump out at us, even on that first surface reading, that maybe there's something significant going on there. On the surface, the message of this poem is pretty clear. It's not hard to get good at losing things. It's not a disaster. In fact, it repeats those lines a lot. Now let's talk about repetition and repeating things. So repetition can have 2 effects. One, it drives something home. It makes it easier to remember if we hear it more than once. It tends to, if we return to it over and over, it tends to, over time, it tends to help kind of carve those associations in our mind, those kind of neural connections deeper, which is part of why we do things like study our notes on more than one occasion, because repeating things helps us remember them. It helps like drive a point home. Now the other thing that repetition can do is it can bring things into doubt. Ironically, it can make things stronger, but it can also make them weaker. Especially when it comes to emotions. We tend to see someone having to repeat something over and over as maybe insincere, maybe trying to convince themselves. But think about it. If you have a friend and you ask how they're doing, and their response is, I'm fine. Yours is like, great. And then follow that up over a conversation with, I'm fine. No, really, I'm fine. Seriously, I'm fine. By about the 3rd or 4th time you're probably sitting here thinking, kind of getting the vibe that you're not actually fine. Like you're saying it, but I'm not feeling it. So the question then becomes, how is the repetition in this poem working? Is it in fact driving home the point that losing these things is not a disaster, that it's easy to get good at losing them? Or is it perhaps drawing that point into question? Is it maybe suggesting that it's not actually really, you don't get really good at losing things, and that losing these things is in fact a disaster, at least some of them. So that's something to maybe that you'll probably want to bring up when we get to our discussion on one art. But so we're already again getting hints that maybe this is just driving that point home further, but maybe it's suggesting that in fact the thing that our author is saying is in fact not actually what they are actually conveying, not actually what they mean. If we also look at the things that are being lost, we start off with fairly small things, like door keys, an hour. Like, most people would not call wasting an hour or losing your door keys a disaster. Like, it's inconvenient, it sucks, but it's not the end of the world. If you're losing places, names, destinations, travel destinations, these are things that maybe seem a little more important, but they're also more immaterial. Like keys, a time period, those are concrete things. Time less than the keys, but like they're still very set things that it's very easy to lose. And if you lose places or names or destinations, that's suggesting something bigger than just, oh, I forgot where my keys are, or oh, I didn't spend this hour usefully. It's suggesting that you're losing places. Are you losing like homes? Are you losing, like, is this a place you wanted to go in the case of a destination? Is this a place you were? Losing names. Are you losing the names or the people or the memories of those people? These are abstract things. They're not well defined. And they also seem a little more important, maybe. If you lose an hour, it's not a problem. If you lose, like, a name or a person or a travel goal, those affect you more. Just, it makes sense. Then we move into things that are more concrete again, a watch and houses. But again, they're significant in ways that the keys or hour weren't. If you lose your mother's watch, like, at the very least it suggests that it was like some kind of passed down gift or inherited, like, heirloom. It could, like, maybe you borrowed it. Like, the fact that it's not just I lost a watch, but I lost my mother's watch, suggests that there's some sentimental significance to this thing. And again, these aren't just houses this person is losing, they're loved houses. Houses this person loved, and they have lost them. They've lost homes. And again, bigger things. These are not minor losses. Then we move on to cities, realms, rivers, a continent. How do you own these things? Like, how do you own a city? Well, usually you're from that city or you're in that city. So if you lose a city, that simply means you've had to leave it. Ditto with realms, rivers, continent. These are things that you once had, or you were once in or at, and you've had to leave them. You've lost them in some way. Again, these are more abstract things, but also pretty major things. Like if you lose a continent, like you had lived on a continent, you can't go back, you've lost it. That's not good, presumably. And then we end with this: even losing you, I won't have lied. This person who has a joking voice and a gesture the narrator loves. And again, we're getting more and more, like, these things that we've been losing are getting bigger and bigger. And this is the biggest of them, a person that this narrator loves. What kind of love is it? It's hard to tell. Do we have any textual evidence that tells us? Probably not. It's someone that our narrator loves in some way, and losing them would hurt, although they say it wouldn't be a disaster. Whether we believe them or not, the jury may still be out on that. But yeah, so what kind of love? We don't know. Could be family, it could be romantic, it could be, like a parent or a sibling or a child, it could be a romantic partner. We have no clue. We just don't really maybe have enough evidence to go on for that. But what we do have our narrator saying is that it's not a disaster. But again, this is like the 4th or 5th time we've had our narrator saying, no, it's not a disaster. No, it's seriously not a disaster. It's not a disaster. Even this is not a disaster. We may be beginning to question their sincerity. And then we get that kind of interesting final line. Don't we look like, write it like disaster? With that little interjection telling someone to write something. Who is the narrator talking to? Who are they talking to, and what are they telling them to write? Are they telling themselves to write the end of the poem? Are they telling the you of the poem, the person they're afraid of losing? Are they telling them to write something? Are they telling us as readers to write something? If so, what are those things? Definitely, there's different places you could maybe go with that, as far as possible readings of that moment. So, again, we're seeing places in this poem where there seems to maybe be more going on. Those 2 slant rhymes, the line with the fluster and the line with the gesture. Those also happen to be the first stanza that starts talking about losing specific things, and the last stanza that talks about losing specific things, including or focusing on the losing the you, the even you, even losing you, I won't have lied, and it still won't be a disaster. So definitely, this is suggesting that there's some good work you could probably do, and maybe there's some things being unsaid, but still nevertheless being communicated in this poem. So, this then brings us to our little game for today. It would be more of a game if we were doing this in person, which I like to call, are you better at interpreting literature than Cameron Diaz? His character. So, there is a clip from the movie In Her Shoes up on Blackboard, right after this video. It features Cameron Diaz's character Maggie, who is one of the main characters of the film, who struggles with dyslexia, reading this poem to a blind former English professor who is living in the retirement home she's working in. Maggie, Cameron Diaz's character, is currently estranged from her older sister Rose, played by Toni Collette, whom we see intercut throughout this scene doing various things. So what I'd like you to do, and that's just sort of say, like they're currently on the outs, but they've been very close for years, but Maggie's kind of the free-spirited, like, always getting in trouble. Rose is the kind of responsible, like, has her shit together kind of person who's constantly, like, covering for her sister. And basically, this comes after Maggie has pulled one stunt too many, and she and Rose are just completely on the outs. Like, Rose is like, I'm done with you. I'm done covering for you. Fuck off. And so Maggie and Rose both at this point have been shown that they clearly miss each other, but they are still estranged. So, what I'd like you to do is watch this video of Cameron Diaz as Maggie reading this poem to this English professor, and then interpreting it at his request. And what I'd like you to think about are, first of all, what do you notice about Maggie's literal reading of the poem? Like, so they have her read it in a certain way, because of course she's dyslexic, and also they choose what parts of the poem to present. So, what do you notice about her literal reading of the poem? What effect does it have on you as a viewer? And why do you think the creators chose to do things this way, to set things up this way? Then, I'd like you to think about her interpretation of the poem. Do you agree with her interpretation, in whole or in part? What parts do you think she analyzed well and did a good job of, and why? Like, why do you think she did a good job? What parts do you think she analyzed poorly, and why? In what ways does the poem seem to be working not as a poem in and of itself, but in serving the larger goals of the movie? Keeping in mind that we may or may not have seen the entire film. This is like, I guess, close to 20 years old now, I think, or nearing that. So you may not have seen this movie, which is totally fine. But even if you haven't, you at least have enough of a postage stamp that you can see how maybe this poem is being used in service of the larger narrative of the movie. And then, what I'd like you to end with is that the professor that she reads this for and interprets it for, he gives Maggie an A+ for her analysis. And my question is, based on what you've done as far as how you've critiqued and felt about her reading and analysis of it, what grade would you give her as a reader, and what grade would you give us as a class? Whether that, that actually works better in person. So yeah, don't worry about what grade you'll give us as a class, but what grade would you give her as a reader? Would you give her that A+? Do you think she really just knocked it out of the park? Do you think she did, some things well, some things not so good, but most part okay, so like a B-ish, B+? Do you think she really kind of tanked it and want to give her like a D or an F? What grade would you assign Maggie and for her interpretation of this poem? So, watch the video, and then what I'd like you to do is post our discussion post on how you think Maggie's interpretation of the poem differed from the one that I've given you, the one that you came to yourself as reading the poem, and in what ways she's using those strategies that we've talked about as readers, and done those things that we want you to do as a reader or that we don't want you to do as a reader. So that is it for today. For next week, we will be talking about, I believe, kind of reading critically in preparation for writing about literature, before we dive into the actual elements of fiction, which is what we will usually be kind of... Actually, I think we will start that next week, actually. So next week we're doing reading critically to write about literature, and then we'll start looking at the elements of fiction. And specifically, we will be doing, for our reading for that first part, Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Also, we will be having a quiz on that story, so keep an eye out for that. That should be going up within a day or so. And also remember that the autobiography of a reader-writer assignment, that is going to be due at the end of this week. So you want to get that up by ideally the end of Sunday. I'm not going to count off if you don't, but I do want you to do your best to keep up with those deadlines, just because if you're keeping up with those, then you're keeping up with the class, and you won't have a mad rush at the end of the semester to get everything in before the absolute drop-dead deadline. So that is it for today. Have a good weekend, and I will see you all next week.